From a biological point of view, work is the ability of an organism to carry out chemical reactions, which means movement of molecules. And when you move molecules, obviously you're carrying out work. You are either breaking or building things. All of these things can be geared and moved towards maintaining all of the important processes of life. Before we go deeply into energy, we need to understand some of the basic concepts that allows one to appreciate the continuous utilization of energy in a biological system. So let's discuss the laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics basically says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Energy can be transferred from one form to another, from potential energy, which is stored energy like the energy you have in a lump of coal, to kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion. So the first law says energy can neither be created nor destroyed, just transferred from one form to another. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is much more complex. It basically says that when you go through the process of transformation of energy, that process is going to be inefficient. The result is going to be an increase in heat and an increase in entropy. Entropy is the tendency of disorder, of a system to go from order to disorder. So the second law of thermodynamics says that you're going to have a decrease in order at the atomic level, but you're going to have an increase in entropy. Now let's look at the laws of thermodynamics in the model that we're looking at on your screen. Now, in the transformation of energy, we're going to be moving from potential energy to kinetic energy. And let's see how the laws of thermodynamics fit. When you look at your screen, we see that we are burning some coal. We're taking potential energy, which is stored chemical energy, transferring it to heat and steam, and the potential energy is going to be transferred to mechanical energy, or sometimes referred to as kinetic energy. Now, if you look carefully, we see that from the left, we see that the stored energy in coal has been changed to steam. The steam has now been changed to kinetic energy. And through this process, entropy has increased. Order from this nice solid coal has gone from high order to disorder. So entropy has increased and order has decreased. Okay, let me try to rephrase this a little bit. Okay, again, looking at the transfer of energy, the coal has potential energy. We're going from a high-ordered coal, transferring it to steam, from steam to kinetic energy, which is energy of motion. As you can see, entropy has increased and order has decreased. So when we look at energy from a practical point of view, we can see that in the transformation of energy, energy obeys the second law of thermodynamics. It's an inefficient process. When we look at a conventional power plant, we have a 34% efficiency in the transfer of energy. When we look at an automobile engine, when we start an automobile, the gasoline is converted from potential energy to kinetic energy. We see that that is 25% efficient. When we look at a human body and the process of conversion of glucose, which is potential energy, converting it to the energy of motion and the movement of a body, and all of that takes place through the process of respiration, we see that an organism is 30% efficient in the transformation of energy. So, How is energy released and used in a living organism? Basically, we're looking at breaking and making of chemical bonds. We have to understand that all of the energy that we're looking at is present in the chemical bonds that make up the macromolecules that we discussed earlier. These chemical bonds are formed by covalent bonding of electrons. And when we break these electrons and we break these bonds apart, energy is going to be released. We have to look at this from two perspectives. One, exergonic and endergonic chemical reactions that take place. If we take some glycogen, which is stored energy, and break it apart to glucose, when we take glycogen, which is a complex monomer, as you can see, and we break it apart to simple molecules of glucose, that process gives off energy, as you can see to the right. Energy comes out. Therefore, it is referred to as an exergonic reaction. If we now want to take the glucose, and sometimes an organism will do so, take the glucose and glue those molecules back together again to form the long linear polymer of glycogen, energy is required. Therefore, we refer to this as an endergonic reaction. So therefore, endergonic and exergonic chemical reactions are always occurring in the process of energy metabolism. All of us realize that when an organism requires energy, an organism will go out and eat some food. You eat a lump of sugar, the sugar is converted by some magical process, and the sugar is broken down and energy is released. Now, the reality is, when we break down the sugar molecule, energy is released. That's true. When we burn a lump of coal, energy is released. But the energy is released as heat. When we burn sugar in a biological furnace, we release heat. But that heat cannot be used by the organism to carry out chemical reactions. And this is what energy is used for. So what an organism does is capture that energy into an intermediary. And the intermediary molecule is called ATP, probably the most important macromolecule that we have. Let me backtrack. Probably the most important molecule a living organism produces. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is a nucleotide made up of adenine, ribose, which is a sugar, and a series of phosphate groups. ATP is produced after complex digestion of either carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Remember, these are all macromolecules that are broken down, and when that breakdown occurs, energy is released. So, ATP is the energy currency in all biological systems. If you were going to go to a far distant planet and you want to see whether there's life there, one of the best molecules to look for is ATP. So now let's look at ATP and see how it works. Adenosine triphosphate, energy currency in metabolism. Now, if you look at ATP, you see it is made up of the base adenine, ribose, and 3 phosphate groups. Notice that one of the phosphate groups, triphosphate, has a red bonding taking place. This is your high energy that is present in this molecule. Remember, this molecule stores energy. When this molecule breaks down and a phosphate group is released, as you can see from the right in the exergonic reaction. In this exergonic reaction, ATP goes to ADP. When this occurs, a phosphate group is broken off and energy is released, and that energy can be used directly in metabolic chemical reactions, which an organism has to have. If you now look to see what happens when ADP goes to ATP. This occurs when a chemical reaction is taking place, energy is produced, and that energy needs to be stored. So, what happens is the energy from a chemical reaction comes in and glues basically the phosphate group to the two phosphate groups, forming ATP. So, in the endergonic reaction, energy is taken in and ATP is produced. So, ATP and ADP go back and forth depending on the circumstances and the nature of the energy that surrounds a given system. Now let's look at how ATP, as an example, let's look at how ATP works in muscle cells. In this case, we're going to be transporting, calcium across the membrane. Remember, the membrane is made up of a bilipid layer with proteins embedded. In this case, we have enzymes embedded, as you can see. And if you look from the top going down, to start with, we have an enzyme that will capture calcium. Calcium will bind to the enzyme. The enzyme will now collapse. And when the enzyme collapses, it produces a site where ATP will bind. The ATP has energy, and this energy is transferred to the enzyme molecule, causing the enzyme molecule to open up and release the two calcium ions into the exterior of a cell. Once the ions are released, as you can see, the enzyme collapses, releasing the phosphate group, and the phosphate group can go back and form more ATP. So this is an example of how ATP is utilized to actively transport calcium across a cell membrane. So now that we understand a little bit about energy, we're going to look at how metabolic chemical reactions work. Again, metabolic chemical reactions involve energy. So metabolism. What is metabolism? It's the sum total of all chemical reactions in an organism. In metabolism, basically two things are happening. We are either going to be building or breaking down molecules. Second important point about metabolism is that metabolic reactions, all of them will require energy. Either energy will be put into a system or energy will be taken out of a system. In metabolic reactions, enzymes will function in accelerating or facilitating the chemical reactions. We'll talk more about enzymes in a moment. In metabolic reactions occur in an organized process referred to as a metabolic pathway, a series of chemical reactions that will result in a final product. Let's look at a metabolic pathway that occurs on a membrane. Let's look at the overall reaction. A substrate, which is what you start with, is converted to product A, which is then converted to product B, and then finally eventually converted to product C in a linear metabolic pathway. Notice that at every arrow there's an enzyme. Enzyme A is responsible for converting substrate to product A. Enzyme B is responsible for converting A to product B. And enzyme C is responsible for converting product B to product C. Now, if you look at the membrane, you can see how this process works. Look carefully that the enzyme A can take the substrate and sterically put it into a groove to convert it to B, and so on and so on and so on. So look carefully and understand how enzymes work within the membrane system. So to summarize the characteristics of enzymes. Enzymes are protein molecules, big macromolecules. Enzymes will speed a chemical reaction. Enzymes can be used over and over again. Enzymes are very specific in the sense that they will only act on a given substrate to carry out a given end product reaction. The way an enzyme works is it lowers the activation energy of a chemical reaction.